My parents called me on a Thursday morning to tell me they'd made a mistake. My father's voice was rougher than I was used to. He said, "Emma, we should have chosen you." He was talking about the bakery, the one his father had built and he had run for 30 years and had handed to my brother Tyler 3 years earlier. The one that had closed 4 days before this phone call. I sat at my kitchen table with the phone against my ear, and I looked at my window and I thought about what I wanted to say. I said, "I know, Dad." He said, "We're sorry." I said, "I know." There was a silence between us that had a weight to it, not the weight of one phone call, but the weight of 3 years of decisions that had all gone in one direction and none of them back. He said, "Is there anything that can be done?" I said, "No." Not because I was angry, because the bakery was closed, the equipment had been sold, the lease had been terminated, and the customers had found other places. You can't reopen a closed story. You can only live with how it ended. Before I tell you what happened between that conversation and this one, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Drop your city and local time in the comments. I love knowing where you are right now. Now let me take you back 32 years to a kitchen that smelled like butter and cardamom, and a woman named Nora who wrote her recipes in the smallest handwriting I have ever seen. My name is Emma. I'm 32 years old. My grandfather opened a bakery in 1971, and my grandmother Nora ran the kitchen from the first day until the last day she was able to stand at a counter. Hartwell's Bakery sat on the corner of Main and Fenwick in the town where I grew up. It was a building with a green awning and a glass front, and the particular smell that comes out of bakeries at 6 in the morning when the first batch of the day is already done, yeast and warmth, and something sweet underneath everything else that I still can't name in isolation, only in combination. My grandfather built the cases himself. Nora stocked them. My father, Frank, helped from the time he was old enough to be useful, and by the time he was 25, he was running the floor while Nora ran the kitchen. When my grandfather died in 1989, the bakery passed to my father the way things passed in families then, without ceremony, without documentation, through the understood logic of who was there and who had put in the time. I was born into the bakery the way some children are born into a religion, not by choice, by context. I knew the schedule before I knew how to read. Saturday was the big day. You were in the kitchen by 5 if you were helping. The first tray out was always the cardamom rolls, which were Nora's original recipe and which my father had never changed and never intended to. Nora sat with me at the kitchen table, the one in the back of the bakery, not in the front, when I was 9 years old. She spread out her recipe book. It was a small spiral notebook, the kind with the black marble cover, and the inside was covered in her handwriting, the smallest, most precise handwriting I have ever seen, as though she understood that the space inside a notebook was finite and intended to use all of it. She said, "I'm going to teach you these, not because you have to know them, because I want someone to know them the way I know them. I learned them. Not from the book, though I read the book until the pages went soft. From her hands. From the feel of the dough at the right point of proofing. From the specific sound the oven made when the temperature was exactly where it needed to be. My brother Tyler was 4 years older than me. He was in the bakery too, but in a different way. He was there the way teenagers are present in family businesses, theoretically available, practically elsewhere. He knew the basics because he had to. He knew the prices and the opening procedures and how to run the register. He didn't know the cardamom rolls. He didn't know the starter that Nora had maintained for 40 years, feeding it on a schedule she kept in her head without reference to anything written down. He didn't care about those things. My father noticed this. My mother noticed this. And somehow they made a story from it that went like this. Tyler is the business person. Emma is the sentimental one. Tyler will run the company. Emma will love the tradition. And those two things are different roles, equally valuable, naturally distinct. I filed that story away. I filed the way Tyler talked about the bakery when his friends were around, as a local institution, which was technically true, but in the tone of someone describing something they plan to modernize rather than something they intend to preserve. I filed the way my mother said, when I was 23 and asked directly about the succession plan, "Sweetheart, your father and Tyler will figure that out, not you and Tyler. Not all 3 of you. Tyler and your father." I was already filed under something else. Looking back now, here were signs. I just kept believing that the signs would eventually point somewhere different. I was 29 when my father sat me down. Not Tyler. Not both of us. Just me. He said, "We've been talking about the future, the bakery. Tyler's going to take over when I'm ready to step back." He said it the way people say things they've practiced, not cruelly, carefully. I said, "When did you decide this?" He said, "It's been a process." Your mother, Tyler, and I have been talking about it for a while. Your mother, Tyler, and I. 3 people in a conversation I hadn't been part of. He said, "You've always been the one who cared about the recipes, the history. We thought you might not want the management side. Tyler's ready for that." I said, "You thought I might not want it?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Did you ask me?" He looked at his hands. I said, "Dad, did anyone ask me?" He said, "We should have talked to you sooner." I understand that. I said, "I want to run the bakery." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Tyler's already been training. It's been a process. We're pretty far along." I stared at the table. The tablecloth had the specific pattern from the back of the bakery, the room where Nora and I had sat when I was 9. I had been looking at that tablecloth my whole life. I said, "Okay." He said, "I'm sorry, Emma." I said, "I know. I want to tell you what I did after that conversation, because the sequence of it matters." I did not argue further. I did not go to my mother and try a different door. I did not campaign with relatives or stage any version of a public appeal. I went home. And I sat with it. And I thought about what I actually knew versus what I assumed. I knew the decision had been made. Tyler was being trained. The process was, as my father said, pretty far along. I knew. I had not been included in the conversation that led to this decision. I knew. I cared about the bakery in a way that Tyler did not because I was sentimental, because I understood what made it what it was, what I assumed, that maybe there were good reasons, that maybe Tyler had committed to things I didn't know about, that maybe my father had thought about this more carefully than the conversation had shown. I called my friend Rachel. Rachel has known me since we were 16. She is the kind of friend who gives you what you need rather than what you want, and she is good at distinguishing between those two things quickly. I told her what happened. She said, "Do you want to fight for it, or do you want to move forward?" I said, "I don't know yet." She said, "What would fighting for it look like?" I said, "I'd have to convince my father to change a decision he's already made, in a process that's been going on without me, in a family that has already positioned Tyler as the succession answer." She said, "And moving forward?" I said, "I built something else, with what I know." She said, "Which of those is more likely to get you to a place you want to be?" I sat with that. Then I called Rachel back an hour later. I said, "I'm going to move forward." She said, "What does that look like?" I said, "I have 30 years of knowledge about what makes that bakery what it is. That knowledge doesn't belong to Tyler just because the building does." She said, "And Nora's recipe book?" I said, "It's mine." She gave it to me. I spent the next 6 months doing 2 things simultaneously. I started training with a business consultant who specialized in food service, learning the operational side that I'd never been formally taught, which I'd been told was Tyler's domain. And I started paying attention, not obsessively, practically. I visited the bakery as I always had. I watched. I listened. What I saw over 2 years was a man who understood retail and did not understand product. Tyler updated the branding. That was fine. He renegotiated the supplier contracts. That was reasonable. He hired a manager to handle the floor so he could focus on, as he described it, the bigger picture. The manager didn't know the cardamom rolls. The starter, Nora's 40-year-old starter, was stored in a commercial refrigerator that Tyler bought when he upgraded the kitchen equipment. The new refrigerator ran at a slightly different temperature. Nora's starter, which had survived 3 decades of careful tending, died inside 2 months. Tyler didn't notice for a while. When he did, he said, "We'll just use commercial yeast. Nobody will be able to tell." I wasn't there when he said it. My cousin, who still worked the counter, told me. My cousin said, "Your dad was standing right there." I said, "What did he say?" She said, "He didn't say anything." That wasn't the worst part. That wasn't the worst part because there was something else I found out 6 months before the bakery closed. Something that told me the story I'd been watching wasn't just a story about Tyler being unqualified. It was a story about what he'd been doing with the money while the product was dying. My father called me in January, not to discuss the bakery, to ask if I could come over. Just to talk. He looked older when I arrived, not sick, just reduced. The specific reduction of someone who has been carrying something heavy. He said, "I need to show you something." He had a spreadsheet printed on 3 pages. The bakery's accounts for the previous 18 months. He said, Tyler has been drawing a salary that I didn't fully understand the structure of. I read the pages. Tyler's official salary as owner-operator, $46,000 a year, which was reasonable. Additional draws categorized as business development expenses, another $62,000 over 18 months. Business development, a line I recognized from my consultant training as one of the most commonly misused categories in small business accounting. I looked at my father. He says it was all legitimate. Marketing, networking, industry events. I said, what industry events? He said, he can't account for all of it. I set the pages down. I said, Dad, how long has revenue been declining? He said, 14 months. I said, is the bakery viable? He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I don't know. He said, I should have asked you, Emma. I should have asked you before we started all of this. I want to be honest about this period. Because from the outside, the right move might look obvious. My father was showing me the truth. The bakery was in trouble. I knew how to run it. I should have stepped in. But here's what I had also been doing for the 2 years since Tyler took over. I had been building. I had taken the knowledge, the operational side I'd taught myself, the product knowledge I'd grown up with, and I'd started consulting for small food businesses in the region. 3 clients in the first year, 7 in the second. I had an income that was mine, clients who had chosen me, and a reputation I'd built from scratch without the benefit of inheriting anything. And I had done this specifically because the inheritance hadn't come. The pain of being left out had become the fuel for something I genuinely owned. If I walked back into the bakery now, if I became the rescue plan, I would be helping to save something for Tyler that Tyler had damaged. For parents who had decided without me. After years of watching from the outside while the thing I knew best was dismantled. Rachel, when I told her about the spreadsheets and my father's question, said, what does he want from you? I said, I don't know yet. He hasn't asked anything specific. She said, but he will. I said, yes. She said, and what are you going to say? I thought about that. I said, I'm going to be honest. That's all I know. She said, what's honest? I said that I want to help them. I can't save the bakery from where it is. The decision they made has consequences that are real now, and I can't make them not real. She said, and Tyler? I said, Tyler is their problem, not mine. He always was. She paused. She said, Emma, you're not angry at them. I said, I am. I'm just not making decisions from R. There's a difference. My father called twice more in that period, each time with more urgency. The bakery's numbers continued to decline. Tyler was not improving things. The supplier relationships were strained. The regulars who had been coming for decades were thinning. My mother called once. She said, you're fat. You're very worried. He wants to know if you'd come back. I said, come back and do what? She said, help Tyle. Help work with him. I said, Mom, I'm not an employee who can be called in to fix something. She said, we know that. We just thought. I said, I'll talk to Dad, not Tyler. She said, Tyler is running the bakery. I said, I know. That's the problem. Have you ever been asked to fix something that broke specifically because you weren't there, when there was what you'd offered and been turned down? If you know that specific feeling, type enough in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. Because the closing is coming, and the phone call after it is where this story turns. Tyler called me on a Wednesday. He had never called me about the bakery. Not once in 2 years. He had not called me when Nora's starter died. Had not called me when revenue started declining. Had not called me when my father started seeing the spreadsheets. He called when the building's lease renewal came up, then the landlord wanted a 15% increase. He said, Emma, I need your help. I said, with what? He said, the lease. And some other things. I need someone who knows what they're doing. I said, Tyler, you've been running the bakery for 2 years. He said, I know. I've had some trouble with the financial side. Some trouble. I said, what kind of help are you looking for? He said, I thought maybe you could consult. Look at things. Tell me what you do. I said, you want me to consult on a bakery that I offered to run, that I was passed over for, that has been declining for 14 months. He said, I know how that sounds. I said, do you? He said, Emma, I'm asking for help. I said, I understand that. I said, here's what I'm willing to do. I will look at the operational picture. I'll give you an honest assessment. But I need to be clear, I'm doing it as an outside consultant, not as family, and whatever I tell you, you have to decide what to do with it. He said, okay. He said, thank you. He said it with the specific relief of someone who has been drowning and just found something to hold on to. I did the assessment. It took 2 days. I reviewed the accounts, the supplier contracts, the staffing, the product line, and the customer data. I wrote a report. I handed it to Tyler and my father together. The report said, in clear language, that the bakery could potentially be stabilized but would require significant operational changes, a return to the original product line that the customer base had come for, renegotiation of the supplier relationships, and an honest accounting of the business development draws that had drawn capital away from core operations. It also said, the starter is gone. What made this bakery distinct for 40 years cannot be recreated. You can run a bakery on this corner. You cannot recreate Hartwell's without what built it. Tyler read it and said, what about the cardamom rolls? I said, commercial yeast can make something similar. It won't be the same. He said, can you tell? I looked at him. I said, yes, I can tell. And the customers who have been coming for 30 years can tell. He said, what do what? I said, that's your decision. You're the operator. What do you think Tyler did with the report? Option A, he implemented the changes and stabilized the business. Option B, he implemented some changes and avoided the uncomfortable ones, and the bakery continued to decline. Option C, he did nothing, and the business closed within 6 months. Drop your answer in the comments. The bakery closed on a Monday in November. The last service was the Satuan our day before. I know, because my cousin texted me. She said, it's the last day. If you want to come. I didn't go. Not from bitterness. From the understanding that my presence there, on the last day, would have been for me. For some closure I was telling myself I needed, and not for anything real. I had my closure. The Sunday night before the bakery's official last day, I sat in my apartment with Nora's recipe book. I had taken it out of the box I'd stored it in 2 years earlier when Tyler took over. I'd put it away because looking at it had hurt in a way that wasn't useful. I'd known the recipes by heart. I hadn't needed the book. I'd put it away so I didn't have to see her handwriting and think about the starter dying in Tyler's new refrigerator. I took it out. The cover was the same. The black marble. The small spiral binding. I opened it. Her handwriting. The smallest handwriting I'd ever seen. Every page is dense with it. The tears came without warning. Not a collapse. A quiet overflow that I let happen at my kitchen table on a Sunday night. I cried for Nora, who had maintained that starter for 40 years and trusted that someone would keep it alive after her. I cried for my father, who had built something real and handed it to the wrong person and was going to have to live with that. I cried for the 30 years of customers who had come for the cardamom rolls and were going to find a closed door on Monday. And I cried for myself. For the person who had been 19 years old and learning recipes in the smallest handwriting she'd ever seen and had believed, on some fundamental level, that the care she brought to that learning would eventually be recognized. I let it be over. Then I closed the book, put it on the kitchen shelf where I could second, and thought about what was going to come next. If someone you loved poured something into you, knowledge, attention, the small handwriting of decades of experience, and trusted that you would carry it forward, tell me in the comments. Now, let me tell you what happened after the closing. Thursday morning, 4 days after the closing, my father's call came at 9:22. He said, Emma, we should have chosen you. I said, I know, Dad. He said, We're. I said, I know. He said, is there anything that can be done? I said, no. He was quiet. I said, the building's lease is gone. The equipment was sold. The supplier relationships are damaged. You can't reopen Hartwell's. That's over. He said, could you do something new? Using what you know? I sat with that for a moment. I said, Dad, that's what I've been doing for 2 years. On my own. The consulting practice. He said, I know, I meant, could you do it with the bakery name? Reopen somewhere? I said, that's a different conversation, and it would have to start from the beginning. With the understanding that what made Hartwell's Hartwell, he said, because of the starter. I said, because of a lot of things. He said, if we'd given it to you? I said, Dad. He stopped. I said, I need to say something, and I need you to hear it without responding right away. He said, okay. I said, 3 years ago, you made a decision without including me in the conversation. You and Mode Tyler. And I accepted it because I didn't have another choice. And then I built something else. And the something else is real, and it's mine, and I'm proud of it. He said, we know. I said, I'm not in a position to rebuild the bakery because the bakery is the consequence of a decision you made. And consequences are real. I can't make them not real. I wouldn't want an even if I could, because the consequences are part of the truth. He said, Emma. I said, I love you. And I can't undo 3 years. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, can we scan you? I said, yes, of course. I said, that's different from the bakery. That's family. Those are 2 separate things. He said, okay. He said, when? I said, whenever you want. He said, this weekend? I said, yes. The consequences fell like dominoes. Each one made a sound. Tyler filed for business dissolution within 2 weeks of the closing. The business debts, primarily the underpaid supplier invoices and the outstanding lease payments from the final months, were processed through the dissolution, which affected my parents' credit in ways they hadn't fully understood when they'd co-signed certain agreements. My father's accountant told them the dissolution would have ongoing effects for 2 to 3 years. My father told me this on the phone, and his voice had the flat quality of someone reading from a document he doesn't fully understand and hopes no one needs. I listened. I didn't say, I could have told you this would happen. That wasn't useful. It was true, but truth served a particular person in that moment. I said, I know a good accountant who works with small businesses going through closures. I'll send you his information. He said, thank you thanker called me once. Not to apologize. To ask whether I thought there was any way to save the Hartwell's name through my consulting practice. Whether I could trademark it or use it for a new venture so the family name wouldn't disappear. I said, Tyler, I'm not going to take the Hartwell's name. It's not mine to take. And it's not mine to rebuild. He said, but you both do something with it. I said, what I'm doing with it is what I've always done with it. I know what I know because of those 30 years. I carry that with me. I don't need the sign. He said, I thought maybe we could. I said, Tyler, I need you to hear me clearly. We're not doing anything together right now. You made decisions that had consequences. Those consequences happened. I am not the solution to them. He said, I know you're angry. I said, I'm not angry. I'm clear. He was quiet. I said, call me in a year. If you want to have a different conversation by then, we can have it. He didn't call for 14 months. When he did call, the conversation was different. Shorter. Honestly, uncertain in a way the first call hadn't been. He said, I think I knew I wasn't the right person. I think I wanted it to prove something. I said, I know. He said, I'm sorry. I said, I believe you. I said, that matters. But it changes what it changes, and not more than that. He said, yeah. He said, what are what working on now? I told him about a client, a family-run restaurant going through a transition. The kind of work I'd been building for 2 years. He said, you're this. I said, yes, I am. That was a different conversation. My parents came to visit that first weekend after the closing. My mother cried briefly in the kitchen when she saw Nora's recipe book on the shelf. I let her. My father looked around the apartment the way he'd been looking around his own house lately, taking stock of things he'd assumed would always be there. We had dinner. I cooked. The cardamom rolls were not on the menu. I wasn't ready for that yet. But the dinner was good. Real. My father helped wash up afterward. We stood at the sink together and didn't say much. At one point, he said, you're gonna be okay. I said, I was already okay. He said, I mean, going forward. I said, I know what you mean. And yes, I am. 6 months after the closing, I made the cardamom rolls. Not for anyone. Just to know I still could. I used the recipe from Nora's book, the handwritten version, in her smallest precise handwriting. I used the commercial yeast that Tyler had switched to, which was all I had. I used my own starter, which I'd begun maintaining the year Tyler took over, because I had understood on some level that Nora's might not survive. My starter was 6 months old, not 40 years, but mine. The rolls came out of the oven at a slightly different color than I remembered. The texture was close, the cardamom was right, the proportion in Nora's handwriting was clear. They were good, not the same. Good. I ate one at the kitchen table with coffee and thought about what Nora had said when she taught me the recipes. I'm going to teach you these. Not because you have to know them, because I want someone to know them the way I know them. Someone knew them. The rolls existed because someone knew them. That was enough. I called my father. I said, I made the cardamom rolls. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, How or Howie? I said, Good. Not the same. Good. He said, I'm glad someone made them. I said, Me too. He said, Nora would be glad. I said, Yes, I think so. My parents and I are in a different place now than we were before the closing. Not restored to what I thought we had before Tyler took over. That's not possible. You can't go back to an understanding that turned out to be incomplete. You can only build from what's actually there. What's actually there is two parents made it that cost them something real, and a daughter who built something they didn't give her permission to build, and the specific honesty that comes after you stop pretending. My father has started asking about my work. Real questions, with listening behind them. My mother asks about my clients, about what I'm building. They're trying in a late way and imperfect and genuine. I receive it the same way. It's a morning in March. Early. The light comes in from the east at this hour. The kind of pale light that belongs to the edge of winter becoming spring. Coffee is on. Nora's recipe book is on the shelf. My starter is in the back of the refrigerator, where I check it on Thursdays, the way she kept hers. Not written down anywhere, just remembered. I've been thinking about what this year taught me. Not about my parents, not about Tyler. About the specific thing that happens when a decision is made about you without your knowledge, and you accept it, and you build something else. And then the people who made the decision come back to tell you they were wrong. The timeline doesn't reverse. The acknowledgement matters. It genuinely matters. It is not enough when someone says I was wrong and means it. That lands. It changes something. But it doesn't give back the years. It doesn't restore the starter. It doesn't unlock. It doesn't rebuild the 3 years of customer relationships Tyler let thin out, or the supplier trust he damaged, or the specific quality of a product that took 40 years to build and less than 2 to lose. You can be right and also be too late. That's the honest sentence. My parents were right when they called on that Thursday morning. They had made a mistake. They knew it. They said it. And it was too late. Not too late for us. We are still family, still trying, still having dinners that end with someone at the sink. That part is not too late, but too late for the thing they'd hoped to recover. Too late for the option that had been in front of them 3 years earlier. Too late for the version where they made a different call, and we never had this conversation because there was nothing to regret. That version doesn't exist. This one does. And in this one, I have a consulting practice I built from scratch. I have clients who found me, chose me, pay me, and for what I know. I have a starter I've been maintaining for 2 years that isn't 40 years old, but is mine. I have Nora's recipe book on a shelf I chose, in an apartment I chose, in a life I built when the one I expected didn't arrive. My parents didn't give me this. Their decision to give it elsewhere is the reason I have it. That's not a comfortable thing to hold. I don't think comfort is the point. The point is what's true. What's true is, I kept going. I used what I knew. I made something real in a space I had to create myself. And when they came back and said they were sorry, I could receive that without needing it to mean something it couldn't mean. I didn't win against my family. There's no winning version of this story. There's just the version that happened. A mistake was made, time passed, consequences arrived, and the person who was passed over had already become someone who didn't need the thing she'd been passed over for. That person is me. The cardamom rolls are mine to make or not make. The recipe is in the book on the shelf. The starter is in the refrigerator. The morning light is exactly what it is. Has someone ever told you they were wrong? Genuinely, clearly, with no excuses. And it still wasn't enough to change what had already happened. Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. Tartar in the comments if this story stayed with you. Subscribe and hit the bell. A new story every day. Check the description for more stories like this one. I'll see you tomorrow.